They poured fish into the desert. They laid humble squares of straw onto the burning sand. At first it looked absurd, almost like a desperate trick, but this was no performance. This was survival. And not in some far-off experiment run by wealthy nations with unlimited budgets, but in a small landlocked country in West Africa, Burkina Faso. For generations, the Sahel has been a graveyard of dreams. The wind never rests, the sun never forgives, and each year the desert advances a little farther, swallowing fields, villages, and hope. Farmers have watched their wells dry. Mothers have seen their children leave for the cities, or worse, the militias. Entire communities have slipped into the sand without a sound. What war could not destroy the desert threatened to erase. And yet against this merciless enemy, a young president named Ibrahim Traoré has dared to fight back. Not with grand speeches, not with billion-dollar machines, but with the simplest of weapons, straw water and fish. In a world still paralyzed by debates over climate change, Traoré rolled up his sleeves and chose action. He turned discarded stalks into shields, dead ponds, into sources of food and despair, into dignity. The question now is as bold as it is unsettling. Can straw really hold back the Sahel's shifting sands? Can fish truly help feed and anchor a nation? And more importantly, if one of the poorest countries in the world can engineer life in the desert, what excuse do the richest have for inaction? This is more than Burkina Faso's struggle. It is a mirror held up to the rest of us. Will we learn from those who have the least, yet dare the most? Or will we continue to let the desert weather of sand or indifference consume us all? Please share this story if you feel you are among the first to recognize and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe that truth matters more than headlines. And comment below, can we continue to trust Ibrahim Traoré's vision, or should the torch be passed to someone else? The crisis did not erupt with gunfire or explosions. It arrived silently carried on the wind. Year after year, the Sahel's sands crept farther south, swallowing farmland grain by grain. In northern Burkina Faso, entire villages vanished, not because of war, but because the earth itself had turned against its people. Families who once lived from millet and sorghum found only barren dust. Wells dried, cattle collapsed. Hope began to decay under the same merciless sun that rose each morning. By 2023, one-third of Burkina Faso's territory was on the verge of becoming uninhabitable. What the world dismissed as climate change statistics, Burkinabe families lived as a national emergency. President Ibrahim Traoré, only in his early 30s, recognized what many ignored speeches would not stop the desert. For too long, Africa had been promised aid packages, expert missions, and international conferences, while its land withered away. He chose another path. Instead of waiting for billion-dollar technology, he began with the most unlikely ally: straw. Straw to most was waste dry stalks burned or discarded after harvest. But in Traoré's vision, it became a weapon. Across the Sahelian provinces, his government mobilized communities. Men, women, even schoolchildren gathered to weave straw into bundles, binding them into perfect squares. These squares were then laid in checkerboard patterns across the dunes. To an outsider, it looked absurd, a board game against death itself. But the logic was simple and brilliant. The straw slowed the wind. It trapped pockets of moisture. It began to decompose, feeding the soil just enough to give seedlings a chance. Inside each square saplings were planted hardy native trees like acacia and moringa. These species could withstand scorching heat, anchor the soil, and provide food, shade, and medicine. Slowly, the impossible happened. In the straw-marked grids, the air cooled. Winds lost their sting. Young trees that should have died in days survived for weeks, then months. For the first time in living memory, the desert seemed to pause, but straw alone was not enough. In the Sahel, the rarest treasure is water. Beneath the shifting dunes lay ancient aquifers and seasonal underground flows from distant highlands. Engineers, soldiers, and hydrologists worked together to tap this hidden lifeblood. They built artificial ponds in strategic zones, not just as watering holes, but as incubators for a new idea: fish farming. At first, people laughed. Fish in the desert. How could life survive where even trees struggled? Yet Traoré insisted. He argued that if Burkina Faso could master its water, it could master its survival. Into these ponds came tilapia, a hardy species that could thrive in controlled environments. Solar-powered sensors monitored oxygen and pH levels. Automatic feeders adjusted to the appetite of the fish. Young men once jobless and wandering now became fish farmers proud to provide protein for their families. Within months, the first harvests arrived. Small, yes, but monumental. These were not just fish. They were proof that the desert could be challenged, that ingenuity could replace despair. Markets in dusty towns began selling Sahel-grown tilapia, a product unthinkable a year before. Villages long abandoned saw families return, drawn back by the promise of fertile soil and water. Children who had fled to cities or been lured by militias were now helping their parents tend straw fields and measure pond levels. The government quickly moved to link these efforts, straw grids, trees, water ponds, and fish, into a new ecosystem engineered not by foreign consultants, but by ordinary people. Women's cooperatives managed nurseries for young trees and prepared fish feed. Local chiefs organized straw collection campaigns. Even the army, once seen only in uniforms and checkpoints, now helped lay straw and plant trees in vulnerable zones. Step by step, Burkina Faso's quiet rebellion against the desert took form. What once seemed impossible, life returning to sand, was now undeniable. The Sahel's advance had slowed not because of miracles, but because of the hands of farmers' students, mothers, soldiers, and a young president who refused to surrender. This was the beginning, a fragile but undeniable signal that Burkina Faso could fight back not with slogans or borrowed blueprints, but with its own labor, its own vision, and its own dignity. The turning point came not in a conference hall or on a foreign television channel, but in a dusty provincial city called Ouagadougou. It was here that President Ibrahim Traoré chose to stand before villagers, elders, and schoolchildren, holding nothing more than a handful of soil. That soil, pulled from land once buried under drifting dunes, was dark, moist, and alive. Raising it to the cameras, he declared, "This is what victory feels like, not in parades or treaties, but in the earth itself." The crowd erupted, elders wept openly, children waved makeshift flags woven from straw. For the first time in years, Burkina Faso felt the desert retreating, not just from the land, but from the nation's spirit. This moment marked the climax of what had begun as a humble experiment. The first tilapia harvests from desert ponds had already silenced the skeptics. Families returned to long-abandoned villages, markets buzzed with a new trade in Sahel-grown fish. But it was Traoré's symbolic act in Ouagadougou that transformed resilience into national pride. What had once looked like a desperate gamble now appeared as a collective triumph. Soon whispers spread beyond Burkina Faso's borders. In Niger and Mali, both equally scarred by desertification, delegations quietly crossed into Burkina Faso to see with their own eyes. They walked the checkerboards of straw laid across dunes, touched the young acacia leaves trembling in the hot breeze, and tasted fish caught just miles from the same sands that once devoured villages. Many left in silence, shaken by what they had witnessed. This was no aid-funded illusion. It was proof that the Sahel's fate could be rewritten. International observers quickly followed. Journalists from Al Jazeera, The Guardian, and National Geographic filed reports that sounded almost mythical: fish swimming in desert ponds, green shoots piercing dunes of dust. Environmentalists hailed it as a miracle in the making. Foreign policy analysts described it as a radical assertion of sovereignty, a poor African nation choosing to define its destiny not by aid, but by its own ingenuity. The United Nations Environment Program released a preliminary report praising the initiative as a locally driven low-tech model with high-impact potential. For once, Africa was not being studied as a case of collapse, but as a source of solutions. Even the United States began to take notice. Inside Washington, USAID officials flagged Burkina Faso's Straw and Fish Initiative as a model to watch. Agricultural scientists from UC Davis and Texas A&M proposed partnerships in aquaculture and desert farming. The Peace Corps drafted plans to adapt Burkina Faso's method into reforestation programs across Francophone Africa. For a nation often overlooked in global politics, Burkina Faso suddenly occupied the center of discussions in climate and development forums. The irony was striking. At a time when global powers poured billions into experimental geoengineering and high-tech climate projects, here was one of the world's poorest countries reshaping its ecological destiny with rakes, straw sunlight, and community labor. It was simple yet undeniable. But the loudest reactions came from within Burkina Faso itself. Across rural provinces, people who once saw themselves as helpless victims of climate change now saw themselves as the front line of resistance. Farmers shared videos on social media of their young saplings and newly dug ponds. Youth proudly introduced themselves not as migrants or militants, but as eco-farmers. The narrative of despair was giving way to one of dignity. And yet not everyone celebrated. Critics, both domestic and international, warned of risks. What if the ponds dried up under harsher droughts? What if fish diseases spread? Could fragile straw grids really withstand stronger winds? The government countered with evolving strategies, rotating ponds, diversifying tree species, deploying drones to monitor land temperature. Traoré's message remained consistent. This was not about being flawless, but about refusing to surrender. The crescendo of reactions from skeptical laughter to global admiration signaled something larger. Burkina Faso was no longer merely surviving. It was inspiring. Its struggle had become a story, its story a challenge, and its challenge a question the world could not ignore. If straw and fish can reclaim the desert, what excuse do the rest of us have for doing nothing? The most profound results of Burkina Faso's straw and fish revolution were not seen first in the landscape, but in the people. Communities once fractured by poverty and migration began to knit themselves back together. Families who had abandoned their villages in despair returned to find ponds filled with fish trees pushing through the dunes and neighbors once again working side by side. For the first time in years, the sound of children's laughter echoed through schools that had reopened in villages thought lost to the desert. Social impact was immediate. Migration patterns began to reverse. In the past, young men from Sahelian provinces faced two grim choices: drift southward in search of unstable city jobs or head north into lawless zones where extremist recruiters waited. Now there was a third path: staying home, not as passive victims, but as active builders. Youth who once considered leaving became pond monitors, tree caretakers, or fish farmers. Women organized cooperatives to manage nurseries and produce fish feed, securing both income and status. For parents, the change was more than economic, it was generational. They could now imagine passing down more than barren land and hardship. They could leave behind hope. Economically, the initiative created ripples across rural life. Markets that once offered little beyond millet and dried goods now displayed tilapia raised in desert ponds, protein that had been scarce and expensive. Tree planting produced not only shade, but also future sources of fruit gum and medicine. Small but meaningful incomes began to circulate, reducing dependency on city remittances. The desert, once a symbol of death, was becoming a source of life. Politically, the transformation was no less dramatic. Burkina Faso has long been a country marked by coups, distrust, and fragile authority. But in this campaign, legitimacy came not from the barrel of a gun, but from results. When government officials visited villages, they no longer came with police escorts, but with shovels, saplings, and listening ears. Local chiefs, once resentful of the capital, demanded more straw, more training, and more ponds. Even opposition figures searching for criticisms found themselves echoing the same language of resilience, innovation, and sovereignty. The straw and fish movement blurred political lines, creating rare consensus in a fractured nation. Security also shifted. In areas once plagued by banditry and militant incursions, attacks dropped. Not because of new military outposts, but because people now had something to defend, land that was slowly coming back to life. Community cohesion grew stronger as neighbors cooperated to lay straw and tend fish ponds. Where trust had eroded, it returned in the simple act of laboring together under the sun. Soldiers who once patrolled with rifles now joined villagers in planting trees, earning respect not through fear, but through shared sweat. Perhaps the most striking consequence was psychological. For decades, many Burkinabe felt trapped in a cycle of dependence, waiting for NGOs, donors, or former colonial powers to dictate their fate. This project reversed that perception. People saw that with their own hands, they could change the trajectory of their nation. Straw and fish became more than tools. They became symbols of dignity. That dignity did not shout in protests or manifest in parades. It grew quietly in the daily work of tending ponds, planting saplings, and weaving straw. Burkina Faso had not solved all its problems. Water was still scarce, hunger still present, and conflict still flaring. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in a generation, people believed that survival was possible not through waiting, but through working. And in politics, as in life, dignity is a force that cannot be easily erased. From Washington to Brussels, the story coming out of Burkina Faso began as a curiosity. At first, analysts dismissed it as a local success too fragile to matter, but as images of green checkerboards and thriving desert ponds circulated in diplomatic cables, policy briefings, and global media, the tone shifted. What seemed like a parable was becoming a model. In the United States, the reaction was layered. Climate experts at universities like UC Davis and Texas A&M praised the initiative as a poetic solution, low-cost, community-driven, and surprisingly scalable. At a time when U.S. political debates on climate focused on trillion-dollar technologies, the simplicity of straw and fish stood out. Some scholars asked bluntly, if Burkina Faso can restore land with straw and ponds, why can't drought-hit regions of America do the same? Inside the halls of power, the initiative caught quiet attention. USAID field officers flagged it as a potential template for resilience programs across the Sahel. The Peace Corps considered adapting parts of it for their reforestation efforts. Even think tanks in Washington, often skeptical of African-led models, began citing Burkina Faso as a case study in community-led adaptation. For a country rarely mentioned in U.S. foreign policy circles, Burkina Faso was suddenly on the radar. In Europe, media outlets like The Guardian and Le Monde highlighted the project not only as an ecological triumph, but as a political statement. Here was a nation often painted as fragile and aid-dependent, proving it could lead. The European public, weary of headlines about migration and instability from the Sahel, now read about fish markets opening in the desert and children planting trees with their parents. Across Africa, the impact was even deeper. Delegations from Niger, Mali, and Chad visited to observe. Leaders privately admitted that if Burkina Faso could make the desert bloom, they could no longer justify inaction. Regional think tanks began discussing how to integrate the straw and fish method into broader Pan-African climate strategies. The African Union quietly circulated Burkina Faso's model in internal reports as an example of sovereignty in practice. But the significance went beyond policy. On social media, especially among the African diaspora in the US and Europe, Traoré's image circulated as a symbol of grassroots leadership. Activists compared his methods to those of Thomas Sankara, framing him as a leader who valued sweat over slogans. For African Americans engaged in climate justice and sovereignty debates, Burkina Faso's story resonated as proof that resilience could be built from the ground up. Of course, skeptics remained. Western analysts warned of fragility. What if ponds dried? What if funding faltered? But every doubt raised seemed to strengthen the symbolic weight of the project. The fact that it worked at all in one of the harshest environments on Earth was itself revolutionary. Ultimately, the world's gaze on Burkina Faso revealed an uncomfortable truth. Leadership doesn't always come from the wealthiest or the most powerful. Sometimes it comes from those who have the least but dare the most. And that truth forced a question not only for Africa, but for America, Europe, and beyond. If one of the poorest nations can fight the desert with straw and fish, what excuse do the richest have for doing nothing? The desert is patient. It does not retreat forever. Even now, the Sahel's winds continue to blow. The sun burns hotter each year, and the pressures of climate change accelerate. Burkina Faso's straw and fish revolution is not a final victory. It is a fragile line drawn in the sand, a beginning that must be defended. Without vigilance, ponds can dry, trees can wither, and hope can vanish as quickly as it was restored. Yet the deeper lesson is clear. What began as survival in Burkina Faso has become a message to the world. The poorest of nations, armed with little more than straw, water, and courage, has done what billion-dollar conferences still only promise action. This is not just an ecological project. It is a civilizational warning. If Burkina Faso can act, what excuse do larger nations have? If Ibrahim Traoré and his people can force life from barren dust, what prevents others from doing the same? But there is also a political and moral dimension. For decades, Africa was told to wait for aid, for loans, for permission. Today, Burkina Faso is no longer waiting. By reclaiming its land, it is reclaiming its dignity, and in that act, it challenges the global order itself. Will the world embrace this lesson of humility and resilience, or will it dismiss it until it is too late? And here lies the question for all of us. Can we continue to trust Ibrahim Traoré's vision as the path forward for Burkina Faso, or should we prepare for another leader to take the torch? Do you believe that his national reform strategies are already effective, or must they grow far stronger to hold back the desert's advance? Because what is happening in Burkina Faso is not just about Africa, it is about us. It is about whether humanity will fight for the soil beneath its feet or surrender to the sands of time. It is about whether we will choose dignity over despair, action over apathy. Please share if you feel you are one of the first to recognize and support President Ibrahim Traoré. Subscribe if you believe the truth is more important than the headlines. And comment below, can straw and fish truly save Africa's future, or is this just the first step in a much longer battle? The desert waits. The question is, do we